The morning Minnie Easton walked up Wallace Walker's dirt road with a wooden crate balanced against her hip and grief etched into every line of her face. Neither one of them had any idea that their lives were about to change forever. It was the autumn of 1874, deep in the hill country of central Texas, where the live oaks were turning amber and the creek beds ran low after a dry summer. The town of Heller's Crossing sat 12 miles to the east, a modest settlement with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as a courtroom when the circuit judge passed through, and a church that smelled of pine resin and old hymnals. Wallace Walker's ranch sat out on its own, past the ridgeline and through the cedar breaks, far enough from town that a man could hear himself think and close enough that he could ride in for supplies without losing a full day. Wallace was 34 years old that autumn. He had broad shoulders from years of fence posting and hay baling, and he had the kind of quiet that some people mistook for coldness and others recognized as steadiness. He had built the ranch himself, every beam and every stone, after the war had taken two of his brothers and left him with an inheritance of red clay soil and a falling-down homestead. He had rebuilt it. He was proud of what it had become. But the house had only ever held one person, and the silence inside it had grown heavier with each passing year. Minnie Easton was 28. She had been married to Robert Easton for 6 years, and Robert had been dead for 4 months when she appeared on Wallace's road. Robert had been a carpenter and a decent man, a man who laughed easily and worked hard and had never once raised his voice at her in anger. He had caught a fever in June, a fast and terrible fever that had taken him in 9 days, and it had left Minnie with a small rented house on the edge of town, a daughter named Clara who was 4 years old, an empty larder and a box of the finest carpentry tools in Heller's Crossing. She had sold almost everything else already. The furniture Robert had built piece by piece, the good dishes that had been a wedding gift from his mother, the extra horse, the cart. She had kept the tools longer than she should have, because they were Robert's hands in a way, the extension of everything he had been, and letting them go felt like letting him go all over again. But Clara needed to eat, and winter was coming, and a woman alone in 1874 Texas had precious few ways to keep herself and her child alive without making decisions that broke her heart. She had heard about Wallace Walker from the widow Burrell at the church social. Mrs. Burrell had said he was a fair man, a man who didn't cheat and didn't bluster, a man who might have use for good tools. She had said he had a big ranch and no wife, and kept mostly to himself. And that last part had given Minnie a complicated feeling. She did not entirely examine as she packed the crate and strapped it to her back and walked the 12 miles because she no longer had a horse or a cart. She walked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping twice to rest by the side of the road, Clara walking quietly beside her for most of it and riding on Minnie's back for the last 2 miles when her small legs gave out. When they came through the cedar break and saw the ranch spread out below them, Minnie stopped and stared for a long moment. It was a proper spread. Not grand, not showy, but solid and well kept in a way that spoke of consistent care over many years. There was a main house of limestone and timber, a porch running along the front of it, a barn that was larger than the house, 2 corrals, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that was mostly harvested down now but showed the evidence of a serious summer growing season. There were 3 horses in the near corral and 2 more out in the pasture beyond. Smoke came from the chimney of the main house, thin and blue against the pale autumn sky. Minnie hitched the crate higher on her hip, took Clara's hand, and walked the last quarter mile down the slope to the barn, because that was where she could hear someone working. The sound of a hammer came through the open barn doors, steady and purposeful. She stood in the doorway and waited. Wallace Walker was on his knees inside the barn, repairing a broken plank in the floor of one of the horse stalls. He was using a hammer and a chisel that had seen better days, and the plank was giving him trouble. He did not hear her right away over the sound of his own work, and so Minnie had a long moment to look at him before he knew she was there. He had dark hair that had started to silver at the temples, and his face was weathered and serious, and his hands were large and capable-looking even from a distance. She cleared her throat. He turned. He looked at her and then at the child beside her and then at the crate she was carrying, and he read the whole of the situation in about 3 seconds, because a man who lived alone and paid attention had a tendency to take in information quickly. He stood up. He set down the hammer. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Walker," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "My name is Minnie Easton. I am Robert Easton's widow. You may have known him. He was the carpenter in town." "I knew him," Wallace said quietly. "I was sorry to hear of his passing." Minnie nodded once. "I have his tools," she said. "They are the best quality carpenter's tools in 3 counties, and I am told that a man with a ranch of this size always has need of good tools. I would like to trade them." Wallace looked at the crate. He did not move toward it yet. "Trade them for what?" he asked. This was the part she had rehearsed on the road. This was the part she had told herself she would say plainly and without apology, because begging was one thing and a fair trade was another, and she had decided weeks ago that she would not beg. "A place to stay for the winter," she said. "For myself and my daughter, I will work for my keep. I can cook and clean and mend and manage a kitchen garden, and I am not afraid of hard work. The tools are worth more than a winter's board, and that is a fact any honest man would acknowledge. I am offering you a fair trade." She held his gaze while she said it, even though everything inside her was shaking. Wallace Walker looked at her for a long time. He looked at the little girl, who was staring up at him with dark, serious eyes very much like her mother's. He looked at the crate of tools. And then he looked back at Minnie Easton and said, "You walked 12 miles. It was not a question." "Yes," she said, "with the child." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. Then he walked toward her and took the crate out of her arms without asking, and the ease with which he lifted it told her something about how heavy it had actually been, because it barely slowed him down. He set it on the barn workbench and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were Robert's tools: a set of chisels in graduated sizes, 2 hand planes, a mallet, a set of auger bits in a leather roll, a marking gauge, a tri-square, a back saw with a rosewood handle, a brace, and a collection of bits for it. They were clean and sharp and oiled because Robert had cared for them the way a craftsman cares for the instruments of his trade, and Minnie had oiled them again herself before she packed them, because it had seemed like the last thing she could do for him. Wallace looked at the tools for a long time. He touched the back saw handle with 2 fingers very gently. "These are fine tools," he said. "Yes," said Minnie. "They are." He closed the lid. He turned around and looked at her and said, "Mrs. Easton, you have yourself a trade." And that was how it began. The room Wallace gave them was small but clean at the back of the house off the kitchen. It had a window that looked out toward the barn and a rope bed frame that he dragged in from a storage room, and fitted with a mattress he pulled from somewhere with the matter-of-fact competence of a man who solved problems rather than discussed them. There was a washstand and a small iron stove for heat, and enough room for the bed and a chair. Clara said it was the best room she had ever seen, and meant it with her whole heart, which told Wallace more about the last few months than Minnie herself had said in words. He fed them that first evening, a plain meal of salt pork and beans and cornbread and strong coffee, and Clara ate 3 servings and fell asleep at the table before the meal was finished. Minnie carried her to the bed, tucked the quilt around her, and came back to the kitchen table, and for the first time since walking in the door she let herself look tired. "She has not eaten a full meal in 2 weeks, Minnie said quietly. It was not self-pity. It was just the truth. Wallace refilled her coffee cup. "Then she will eat well here," he said. That was all. No flourishes, no reassurances, no lecture on the goodness of his heart. Just a plain statement of fact, said with absolute certainty. Minnie looked at him across the table and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for months. "I meant what I said about working," she told him. "I did not come here to be a charity case." "I know it," he said. "And I meant what I said about the trade. We're square, Mrs. Easton. But if you want to cook and keep house, I will not turn down the help. I have been eating my own cooking for 4 years and I am not improving." Something almost like a smile crossed her face and it surprised her. She had not expected to almost smile at anything for a long time. "Is it very bad?" she asked. "The beans came out like gravel last Tuesday," he said, perfectly serious. She did smile then, just briefly, and he saw it, and something shifted in his expression too, something quiet and carefully contained. The first week was a negotiation of space and habit. Wallace was a man of routine, and the routine of a man living alone has its own particular shape, not unfriendly exactly, but fitted to one person's needs and not anticipating the presence of others. He rose before dawn and was in the barn by first light, back in the house for breakfast, out again until midday, back for the noon meal, out until dusk. He was quiet at meals and did not require conversation, which Minnie appreciated, because she was not yet in a place where she wanted to fill silences with words. Clara, however, was 4 years old, and 4-year-olds do not leave silences unfilled. By the third morning, Clara had appointed herself Wallace's breakfast companion, appearing at the kitchen door in her nightgown the moment she heard his boots on the floor, and following him to the table with the unself-conscious certainty of a small child who has decided that a person is safe. She sat across from him and described her dreams in extensive detail while he drank his coffee, and he listened to every word with the patient attention of a man who had perhaps forgotten what it was like to have someone talk to him at breakfast, and found he did not mind it. Minnie watched this from the stove and felt something complicated and tender moving through her. She learned the shape of his days quickly and organized her work around them. She was up before him each morning, the kitchen stove already hot, and the coffee on by the time he came in from the barn. She found the kitchen garden still held late squash and dried beans and herbs, and the root cellar was well stocked with his summer preserves. And with these things plus the provisions he bought on his weekly ride into town, she cooked meals that were not just fuel but actual food, meals with flavor and care in them. The first time she put supper on the table, a roasted chicken with onions and dried herbs and a pan of golden cornbread, Wallace sat down and looked at the food for a moment before picking up his fork. He ate it all and said nothing for most of the meal. Then, as he was finishing his last cup of coffee, he said, "Mrs. Easton, that was the finest meal I have eaten in 4 years." 4 years is a long time to eat gravel, she said. He looked up at her with something that might, on another man's face, have been a grin. On his, it was more of a deepening at the corners of his mouth, a warmth that came up in his eyes. "It is," he agreed. She began to see the things about him that were not immediately visible. The way he checked the barn every night before he came in, making a final round of all the animals with the same steady thoroughness with which he did everything. The way he kept his word absolutely, always, even in small things, so that if he said he would ride out at 7, he rode out at 7, and if he said he would be back by noon, he was back by noon. The library of books in the main room, mostly history and natural philosophy, worn-spined from reading, which told her he was a man with an interior life even if he kept it largely to himself. The way he spoke to his horses, not with the rough efficiency of a man who saw them only as working animals, but with a kind of low, conversational courtesy that assumed they were worth talking to. And the way he treated Clara, he was not effusive with the child. He was not the kind of man who swept her up and tossed her in the air, and made loud exuberant noises that children sometimes love and sometimes find terrifying. He was simply consistently present and patient, which for a child who had lost her father and spent 4 months watching her mother hold the world together through sheer will, turned out to be exactly the right thing. He showed her how to scatter feed for the chickens. He let her hold the handles of the wheelbarrow when he was mucking the barn, though she was too small to actually push it. He fixed her rag doll's arm, which had been hanging by a thread, with a needle and thread from Minnie's sewing kit, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Clara watched with intense seriousness and told him about the doll's name, which was Beatrice, and her extensive personal history. Minnie stood in the kitchen doorway watching that scene and had to turn away, because it broke something open in her that she was not ready to examine yet. Grief was strange. It did not leave on a schedule. It rose up at unexpected moments, not always in response to what you thought it would be in response to, and right now it was rising because a quiet rancher was fixing a small girl's doll, and doing it with such unconscious care that it was almost impossible to bear. She went outside and stood on the back porch and breathed the cool autumn air until she felt steadier. Wallace found her there a few minutes later, after he had finished with the doll. He came out through the kitchen door and stood beside her on the porch and did not say anything, but he handed her a cup of coffee and stood companionably next to her looking out at the pasture, and that wordless company was the kindest thing he could have done. She had been in his house for 3 weeks when she told him the worst of it. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, Clara long asleep in the back room, and Minnie had been going over the household accounts on a piece of paper, because she was an organized woman who needed to know where things stood. She had asked him what he needed from town on his next supply run so she could add it to the list, and from there, the conversation had turned to money in general, and she had heard herself saying things she had not intended to say. She told him about the debts. The doctor had not been cheap, and Robert had been sick for 9 days, and the medicine had cost money they did not have, and so she had borrowed against what she thought would be Robert's future earnings, and when Robert died there were no future earnings and the debts remained. The rented house had been taken back by the landlord within 2 months. She had sold everything she could sell. She had almost sold the tools 3 separate times and stopped herself each time, and she still was not entirely sure why she had stopped herself, except that some part of her had believed they would be the last thing she should sell, that they were the anchor of some final desperate plan that had not fully formed yet. She told him all of this in a flat, clear voice, looking at the table, and when she finished she looked up at him, because she needed to know what was in his expression. She half expected pity, which she hated, or judgment, which she feared more. There was neither. What was in his expression was something that looked like recognition, like a man who had also had to rebuild from nothing, and understood the particular exhaustion and determination that required. "The tools paid for a winter," he said. "We will think about spring when spring comes." "I cannot impose on you indefinitely," she said. "You're not imposing," he said. "You are working for your keep, as you said. The house is cleaner than it has been in 4 years, and the meals are better than they have been since I built the place. And Clara has taught the cat that its name is apparently also Beatrice now, and it seems to have accepted this. So all in all, I think the arrangement is working out favorably for everyone." Minnie stared at him. She had not known there was a cat. "What was the cat's name before?" she asked. "I called it Cat," he said, perfectly seriously. She laughed. She had not laughed, a real full laugh, in 4 months. It startled her. It must have startled him too, because his expression shifted, opened slightly, and there was something in his eyes that was warm and aware in a way that had not been there quite so visibly before. The winter settled in around them like a heavy blanket. The rains came in November and turned the roads to mud, and then in December came the first hard frost that silvered the grass each morning and sent thin sheets of ice across the water troughs. Wallace and Minnie developed a rhythm that was easy and companionable, a domestic language of small gestures and understood routines that grew up organically between 2 people, sharing a space with mutual respect and goodwill. She learned to read his moods, or rather his quiets, because most of his modes were quiet. There was the quiet of contentment, which he wore on mornings when the ranch was running well and the weather was fine. There was the quiet of preoccupation, which came over him when something about the stock or the land was worrying him. There was the quiet of something rarer and harder to name, which she occasionally caught in the evenings when he sat by the fire with a book in his lap but was not reading, and she suspected that quiet was loneliness, the long accumulated loneliness of a man who had been living without real human connection for too many years. She understood that quiet well. She had her own version of it. She started talking to him more deliberately in the evenings, not small talk, not domestic logistics, but real conversation, the kind that mattered. She asked him about the war, and he told her a little carefully, the way men of that era and experience told the parts they were willing to tell and let the rest stay where it lived. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had been a school teacher and had taught her to read before she was 4, about the journey west to Texas when she was 17, about meeting Robert at a barn dance in Heller's Crossing, and knowing within an hour of talking to him that she was going to marry him. That last part was said without sadness, or mostly without sadness, because it was a good memory and she had decided to let herself keep the good ones rather than avoid them to escape the pain of the contrast. Was it a good marriage? Wallace asked. It was a direct question, the kind he was capable of, and she liked that about him, that he asked what he wanted to know rather than circling around it. Yes, she said. A very good one. He was a kind man and a funny man, and he loved Clara fiercely. She paused. I miss him every day, but I am also still here and Clara is still here, and I find I am not interested in the alternative. Wallace nodded slowly. That is a good way to think about it, he said. What about you? She asked. Have you ever been close to marrying? The fire crackled between them. He was quiet for a moment and she thought he might not answer, but he did. Once, he said, before the war. She did not wait. He said it without bitterness, just as a fact laid down. I do not blame her. The war was a long time to wait for a man who might not come back. But you did come back, Minnie said. I did, he agreed. And she had made a good life and I built a good one, and perhaps that was the way it was supposed to go. Do you believe in that? She asked. Things going the way they are supposed to go. He considered it. I believe in making the best of the way they actually went, he said, which may amount to the same thing in the end. She thought about that for a long time after she went to bed that night. December deepened and the cold with it. Wallace kept the fires going and the wood supply well stocked, and Minnie and Clara were warmer that winter than they had been the previous one in the drafty rented house in town. Clara thrived in the country air and the regular meals and the wide-open spaces of the ranch, and she had appointed the cat Beatrice as her constant companion and spent happy hours in the barn watching the horses in their stalls, narrating to them in the serious conversational tone she had apparently learned from watching Wallace. One evening in mid-December, Wallace came in from the barn in a state that was the closest thing to agitated Minnie had seen from him. He had been checking the cattle in the south pasture and found signs that a mountain lion had been working the fence line. He had counted his stock and come up one heifer short, and the tracks told a clear story. He stood at the kitchen table with his hat still on and his coat still buttoned and said, I am going to need to ride out before dawn tomorrow and track it. If it has taken a taste for my cattle, it will be back. Will you go alone? Minnie asked. My nearest neighbor is 6 miles, he said. Jim Hart. I will stop and ask him to ride along. Minnie packed him a cold supper to eat on the road at dawn and did not sleep well, which she told herself was a natural response to any person in her household going out into the dark after a mountain lion, and was not related to anything more particular than that. He came back the next afternoon with Jim Hart riding alongside him, and the mountain lion draped over the back of his horse, and Minnie found that the relief she felt at seeing him come over the ridge was entirely disproportionate to the level of actual danger he had been in, which was the first clear signal to herself that she received, though she filed it away rather than examining it directly. Jim Hart was a lean, weathered man of about 40 with a wide grin and a sociable nature that was the complete opposite of Wallace's own, and he was visibly delighted by the presence of a woman and a small child at the Walker Ranch, in the way that a man who lives alone and likes to talk is delighted by any expansion of available company. He stayed for supper and was an excellent dinner guest, telling stories about the cattle trade and the characters he had known in his years in Texas with a natural performer's timing and a genuine warmth that made even Wallace laugh twice. When Jim finally rode home in the early dark, Minnie cleared the table and said, "He is a good man." "He is the best man I know," Wallace said. "He was with me in the war." He paused. "He has asked me 3 times this year why I have not remarried." Minnie looked up from the dishes. There was something careful in Wallace's voice. "And what do you tell him?" she asked. "That I have not found the right occasion," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the dishes, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the words sat in the kitchen between them like something that had been placed down and was waiting to be picked up. Christmas came and Wallace went into town for supplies and came back with a peppermint stick for Clara and a small paper-wrapped parcel for Minnie that turned out, when she opened it, to be a thin volume of poetry, Tennyson, that he must have found at the general store or possibly traded for somewhere. The inscription on the flyleaf was not from Tennyson but from Wallace himself, 3 words in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting, "For winter evenings." Minnie held the book and looked at the inscription and felt something move through her that she had not felt in a very long time. Not grief, this time, and not the complicated tenderness she felt when she watched him with Clara. Something more particular and more personal. She looked up and he was watching her with an expression she was beginning to learn, closed on the surface but with something alive and uncertain just under the surface of it. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out softer than she had intended it to. "It is nothing," he said, in the way that men say that when they mean the opposite. She made him a Christmas present too, which she had been working on secretly for 2 weeks, stitching by firelight after Clara was asleep. It was a new pair of work gloves, cut and stitched from a piece of heavy leather she had asked him to buy on a supply run under the pretense of needing it for a mending project, lined with a scrap of wool blanket she had unraveled from an old garment. She had sewn his initials into the inside of each cuff in small, neat stitches. When she gave them to him on Christmas morning, he looked at them for a long time and then looked at her and said, "These are the finest gloves I have ever owned," with such simple sincerity that she had to look away, because the way he said things sometimes hit her somewhere undefended. New Year came, and the hard cold of January settled over the ranch like a siege. There were days when the temperature dropped so far that the horses would not leave the barn and the water in the troughs had to be broken twice a day. And Wallace and Minnie fell into the companionable labor of keeping everything warm and fed and functional together, moving around each other in the barn, and the kitchen, and the yard with the easy efficiency of 2 people who had worked out a shared language of task and purpose. It was in the barn, on a January afternoon, that the thing between them first became impossible to pretend was just courtesy. They had been checking on the horses together because one of the mares had been favoring her left front leg, and Wallace had his hands on the horse's knee, feeling for heat, and Minnie was holding the lantern steady, and at some point they were both leaning in to look and they were very close together. Close enough that she could see the silver at his temple in the lantern light and feel the warmth that came off him in the cold air of the barn, and he turned his head to say something about the leg and stopped. Because their faces were about 6 inches apart, neither of them moved for a moment that stretched out past the length of a moment. The mare stamped and shifted and broke it, and they both straightened and went back to the professional business of examining the horse's leg, but something had changed. Something had been named without words, and now it was in the air between them. That night at supper he was quieter than usual, and she was too, and Clara talked about the cat and her plans for spring and the horses and whether they might get a dog, and the ordinariness of it anchored Minnie enough to think clearly. She was a widow. She was living in this man's house, on an arrangement that had been meant as a practical trade for the winter. She had come here out of desperation and necessity, not out of anything she had planned or intended. And whatever was happening between her and Wallace Walker was something she had not planned or intended either, but it was happening. She could not pretend it was not, and the question was what she was going to do about it. She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about difficult things, without flinching from what she actually knew. She was not simply grateful to him. Gratitude was part of it, yes, but that was not what made her heart lift when she heard his boots on the kitchen floor in the morning. That was not what had made her read his Christmas inscription 7 times. That was not what she had felt in the barn with his face 6 inches from hers and neither of them moving. She was falling in love with Wallace Walker. She had not meant to. She was not sure it was wise or fair or anything other than the absolute honest truth. She lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the wind work at the eaves of the house, and she thought about Robert. She thought about him honestly too, the way he deserved. She thought about the 6 years and the good marriage and the easy love that they had built together, and she thought about the grief that had crushed her in June and the long, slow walk back from it, and she thought about what he would have said if he could have said anything. She thought he would have said, "Keep going, Minnie." That was the kind of man he was. She slept finally, and when she woke up in the morning she felt, for the first time in many months, like someone who had a future ahead of them rather than simply a present to survive. She did not do anything immediately. Some things need to be carried for a while before they are ready to be set down in front of another person. But she watched Wallace differently after that, with the clear-eyed attention of a woman who has stopped pretending she is not paying attention, and she saw things she had seen before but differently. The way he always made sure her coffee cup was full before he refilled his own. The way he had, without ever discussing it, shifted his morning barn chores slightly later, so she had more time in the kitchen before he came in for breakfast. An adjustment that could only have been made by a man who was paying close attention to her rhythms. The way he had fixed every small broken thing in her room within a week of her moving in, the wobbly leg on the washstand, the sticky window latch, the uneven floorboard by the stove, all of it done quietly and without announcement. He was, she thought, a man who showed what he felt through what he did. He did not have the easy language of feeling that some men had, but he had the language of action, and once she understood how to read it, she realized it was a language being spoken very clearly indeed. February brought a brief thaw and then a final hard freeze, and in the middle of the hard freeze, Clara came down with a cough that settled in her chest and frightened Minnie badly, because she had seen what a fever could do, and her fear now was hair-trigger in response to any sign of illness in her daughter. She sat up 3 nights running, tending Clara, and by the second night Wallace was sitting up too, bringing fresh water and feeding the small stove in Clara's room, and saying nothing about the fact that he had his own work to do in the morning and had not slept. He went out and harnessed the horse at 3 in the morning of the 3rd night, in the dark and the cold, and rode 12 miles to Heller's Crossing to bring back the doctor, who pronounced it a serious cough but not a dangerous one, left medicine, and charged $2 that Wallace paid without a word about it. When the doctor had gone and Clara was sleeping finally, truly sleeping rather than the restless half-sleep of a sick child, Minnie sat at the kitchen table and Wallace sat across from her, and she was shaking slightly, the release of 3 days of held tension, and without thinking about it at all she put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there with her face in her hands and breathed. She felt his hand come to rest on her forearm. It was a light touch, careful, asking rather than assuming, and she looked up and found him looking at her with everything he usually kept contained visible in his face, the care and the concern and the something more than that, all of it present and undisguised. "She is going to be fine," he said. "I know," Minnie said. "I know she is, She stopped. "I keep thinking about how fast a thing can change, how fast you can lose a person." "Yes," he said. He did not try to argue her out of it or reassure her past it. He just acknowledged it because it was true, and he was a man who told the truth. His hand was still on her forearm. She turned her arm slightly and put her hand over his. Neither of them moved or spoke for a long time, but neither of them moved away either, and the fire ticked in the stove, and outside the wind had finally died down and the night was still. Spring came to the hill country the way it always did, in fits and starts, cold one day and warm the next. But by March the bluebonnets were beginning in the low spots along the creek, and the live oaks were pushing their new pale green leaves, and the ranch was coming alive in the way ranches do in spring, everything needing to be done at once, and the energy of it almost physical in the air. Minnie had been at the ranch for 6 months by then, and the question of what she was going to do next was one she had been putting off because the winter had been about survival, and she had not wanted to think beyond it. But spring had a way of demanding that you think about what came next, and the day she stood in the kitchen garden turning the first beds over with a spade, feeling the good cold earth break under the blade and thinking about what she was going to plant, she understood that she had stopped thinking of this as Wallace's garden and started thinking of it as ours. She stopped and leaned on the spade handle and stared at the turned earth. Ours. She was in love with him. She had known it for weeks in the quiet interior way of a person who knows something but has not yet said it aloud. And saying it aloud, even just to herself in the kitchen garden with no one listening, made it completely real. She was in love with Wallace Walker, and she was going to have to do something about it, because she was not the kind of woman who carried a thing forever without acting on it, and also because she was beginning to be fairly certain, from all the evidence she had accumulated over 6 months of paying very close attention, that he was in love with her too. The question was, who was going to say it first? It turned out not to be either of them who said it first exactly. It happened differently than a conversation, more like a weather event, something building in the air for weeks and then arriving all at once. They were in the barn together on a Thursday afternoon in late March. She had come out to tell him something about the supply list. She genuinely could not remember afterward what it was, and he had been using Robert's tools, specifically the back saw, to repair a broken gate hinge bracket. He had been using Robert's tools regularly throughout the winter, as naturally and carefully as a craftsman uses the tools of his trade, and she had watched this with a complicated tenderness, because he treated them with respect, and that respect felt like respect for Robert, and that mattered to her. He was intent on the work and did not hear her come in, and she stood for a moment watching him, the focused economy of his movements, the way he worked, and something happened in her chest that was so clear and so strong that she must have made some small sound, because he looked up. He looked at her and she looked at him, and everything she had been thinking in the kitchen garden was on her face, all of it, and she watched him read it. He set down the saw. He straightened up. The afternoon light came through the barn door and lay across the straw-covered floor between them, and he crossed it. He stopped in front of her and said, with a formality that was both serious and slightly uncertain, the uncertainty of a steady man taking an unsteady step, "Mrs. Easton, Minnie, I need to say something to you." "Then say it," she said very quietly. "I am aware that you came here out of necessity and that I should not presume to know your feelings," he said. "And I am aware that you have not been a widow for very long and that grief is its own timeline and no one else's business. But I have been trying very hard for several months to remain a purely practical and respectable host, and I find I am no longer equal to it." He paused. "I think about you all the time. I think about you when I am out working, and when I come in, and when I go to sleep, and when I wake up. I think about you the way a man thinks about a person who has changed the shape of things." He stopped again, and there was something almost painful in his expression, the vulnerability of a person who does not say such things, easily exposing himself entirely. "I know that may not be welcome. I know it may complicate things that are already complicated enough. But I will not be dishonest with you, because dishonesty is the one thing I am actually not capable of." Minnie felt the words land in her chest one by one and stay there. "Wallace," she said, and she used his first name, which she rarely did, and the sound of it in her mouth changed his expression. "I came here for a winter and I have started thinking of this as home." She held his gaze. I have started thinking of you as mine, which is forward of me, and I am not sorry about it." Something broke open in his face, something that had been held tightly for a very long time, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his, the large, capable hand she had watched work all winter, and held it with a care that was almost reverential. He kissed her. It was not tentative and it was not overwhelming. It was exactly what it should have been. The kiss of a man who meant everything he said and said everything he meant. And she kissed him back with 6 months of held feeling and the absolute present certainty of a woman who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. They stood in the barn in the afternoon light and held on to each other, and outside through the open door the bluebonnet-studded pasture lay gold and blue under the March sky, and somewhere back in the house, Clara was talking to the cat. What followed was a spring and summer of the happiest ordinary days that either of them had spent in a very long time. The thing between them, now named and no longer in need of containing, made everything around it easier and lighter. They worked the ranch together in a full partnership, planning the kitchen garden and the summer cattle work and the repairs needed on the north fence line. And the conversations they had while working were layered now with the ease of people who are no longer holding anything back, who have dropped the careful courtesies of early acquaintance and moved into something deeper and more frank. He was funny, she discovered, in a completely dry and unexpected way, and making her laugh had become something he clearly took pleasure in, arranging the circumstances for it with a subtlety that suggested he had given it some thought. She was sharper than he had expected, she could tell, the kind of sharp that does not announce itself but surfaces in her observations and her questions, and she could see him recalibrate occasionally when she said something that went further or cut deeper than he had anticipated, and the recalibration was always followed by something that looked like increased respect. They did not discuss the future directly, not at first. They were both people who had been burned by the uncertainty of the future, and who had learned to live in what was present and real, and what was present and real was good enough to be getting on with. Jim Hart came to visit in April, and took in the changed atmosphere of the ranch within approximately 4 minutes of arriving, with the perceptive antennae of a sociable man who pays close attention to human dynamics, and he spent the entire afternoon visit barely suppressing a grin. When he finally rode out, he said to Wallace at the gate, in a voice that carried clearly back to where Minnie was on the porch, "I am going to need you to explain to me again why you have not remarried," and rode away laughing at his own timing. Clara, for her part, had entirely reorganized her understanding of Wallace from the guest-in-residence she had quietly assessed in the first weeks to something else altogether, something she demonstrated one morning in May when she came to breakfast and said, without preamble, "Mother, is Mr. Walker going to be my father now?" The silence at the breakfast table was very brief but very weighted. "That is a very direct question," Minnie said carefully. "I am a very direct person," Clara said, in a tone that was so exactly her mother's that Wallace made a sound into his coffee cup that was definitely a laugh. Minnie looked at Wallace across the table. He looked back at her. There was a whole conversation in the look, the kind of conversation that people who know each other well can have without any words at all, and what it concluded was something that had perhaps been building toward a conclusion for several months already. "I think," Wallace said to Clara in his direct way, "that I would like to be if your mother agrees." Clara nodded as though this was entirely satisfactory. "Good," she said. "Because Beatrice needs a proper father too, and I cannot be expected to manage everything myself." She picked up her cornbread and ate it, and Wallace looked at Minnie over the child's head with an expression of complete helpless warmth, and Minnie looked back at him and thought that this was the moment she was going to remember for the rest of her life. He asked her properly. Not at the table with Clara present, but on a Saturday evening when Clara was asleep, sitting on the front porch in the warm May dark with the fireflies just starting up in the pasture grass and the smell of the flowering cedar on the air. He had been building to it, she could tell, because he had a particular quality of stillness when he was composing something important, and she had been watching that stillness grow across the afternoon and evening. He turned to her and said, "Minnie, I want to ask you something and I want to do it properly." "Then do," she said softly. "I know what you have been through and I know what it cost you," he said. "And I know that what you built with Robert was real and good, and I have never once wanted to minimize that. I would not want a woman who did not love her husband the way you loved him, because the capacity to love that way is what I am asking to be the recipient of." He paused, and she could see that he was holding himself very steady because he was nervous, and the nervousness of this steady man moved her deeply. "I am asking you to marry me, to be my wife, and let this be your home and yours for keeps, not for a winter, not for a trade, but for the rest of your life. And I am asking because I love you, and I want to spend my life doing the particular things I have learned make you happy, which includes keeping your coffee hot and finding poetry books in unlikely places, and occasionally being willing to listen to Clara's extremely detailed narrative about the cat." She was already crying slightly, which she had not planned on, and she was also laughing a little through it, which seemed appropriate. "Yes," she said. "Wallace, yes." He took her hand and brought it to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a formality that was also entirely tender, and then she leaned into him and his arm came around her, and they sat on the porch in the warm May night and looked out at the fireflies and the dark ridge of the cedar break against the stars. They were married in June of 1875 at the church in Heller's Crossing, in a modest ceremony with Jim Hart as witness and Clara as an extremely engaged flower girl who had opinions about the ribbon in her hair and expressed them. The minister, Reverend Cook, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, and the wedding breakfast afterward was held at the church social hall and attended by about 30 people from town and the surrounding ranches, because Minnie had been in Heller's Crossing long enough that people knew her, and Wallace had been part of the community long enough that his happiness was taken as a communal occasion. Mrs. Burrell, who had first told Minnie about Wallace, arrived with a pound cake and an expression of complete satisfaction. "I knew it," she said to Minnie, entirely without embarrassment. "I knew it the moment I mentioned his name." "You told me he might have use for tools," Minnie said. "I knew he had use for something considerably more important than tools," said Mrs. Burrell, and patted Minnie's hand. The return to the ranch that evening, now as husband and wife, was quiet and warm. Clara fell asleep in the wagon on the way home, and Wallace carried her in and put her to bed without waking her, and Minnie stood in the kitchen and listened to his footsteps and felt the house around her with a new and settled sense of belonging that was not the same as what she had felt in December when she had first unpacked their few belongings into the small back room. This was different. This was the feeling of a place that was fully hers, not as a temporary arrangement, not as a trade, but as a fact. She was in the kitchen when he came back from putting Clara to bed, and he came and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression she loved, the open, warm expression he had mostly stopped trying to conceal once she had made it clear she could read it anyway, and said, "Well, Mrs. Walker." She turned around and smiled at him and said, "Mr. Walker," and crossed the kitchen to him. The summer of 1875 was a good one for the ranch. The rains came at the right times and the grass stayed green through July, and the cattle were healthy and the kitchen garden was abundant, and Wallace sold enough beef at the Heller's Crossing cattle market in August to put a comfortable amount aside for the winter and still buy the additional supplies they needed. Minnie expanded the kitchen garden and started a second one on the south side of the house, in a spot Wallace had not planted before, and discovered that the soil there was particularly good for the things she wanted to grow. She also discovered, in September of 1875, that she was expecting a child. She told Wallace in the kitchen in the early morning before Clara was awake, in the matter-of-fact way that she told him most important things, sitting across the table from him with the coffee between them. He went very still when she said it, the way he went still when something moved him deeply, And then he reached across the table and took both her hands and held them and looked at her with an expression of such complete and unguarded joy that she felt it like a physical thing. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling perfectly well," she said. "I am feeling, in fact, like someone who is expecting a child in approximately next April, and who would like to talk about what we should do with the small back room." He laughed. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and kissed her forehead and then her temple and then her cheek and said, very quietly against her hair, "I am so glad you walked up that road with that box of tools." She turned her face into his neck and held on. "So am I," she said. Clara received the news of the forthcoming sibling with the same decisive practicality with which she received most news. "I would like a brother," she said. "Beatrice agrees." "The cat does not get a vote," said Minnie. "She feels very strongly about it," Clara said. The autumn and winter of that pregnancy were different from the previous winter, because now Minnie was in a home that was fully hers and a partnership that was fully equal and a life that had, against all the odds and the grief and the desperate 12-mile walk with a crate of tools, turned into something that felt like it had always been intended to exist. Wallace was attentive without being anxious, which was exactly the right balance, the product of a man who was observant and capable of action and did not confuse concern with hovering. He built a cradle. He built it from a piece of cedar he had been saving, a beautiful close-grained plank, using Robert's tools, and the choice to use those tools was not something either of them discussed, but something both of them understood. The tools had been the beginning of everything. They had been the key that opened the door. It was right that they should be part of this too. Minnie watched him build it over a series of evenings through the late autumn, and the sight of it growing under his hands, planed smooth and joined cleanly, was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Jim Hart came for Christmas that year and brought a wool blanket for the baby and a carved wooden horse for Clara, and a bottle of whiskey for Wallace, and he sat at the Christmas table and looked around it with the expression of a man witnessing something he had been hoping to see for a long time. "You know," he said to Wallace, "the last time I sat at this table it was just you and an old ham and whatever whiskey you had left from the previous Christmas." "The cooking has improved," Wallace said with complete understatement. "Everything has improved," Jim said and looked at Minnie with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Walker, I would like to say that you have done more for this man's general well-being than anything else in the last 15 years, and I say that as someone who has known him for 20. "He did the same for me," Minnie said. "We improved each other." "That is the best kind of arrangement," Jim said, and raised his glass. The baby came in April of 1876, on a clear spring morning when the bluebonnets were again in the pasture, and the air smelled of cedar pollen and fresh water. It was a boy, as Clara had ordered, sturdy and loud and possessed of a great deal of Wallace's dark hair, and they named him James Robert Walker, James for Jim Hart, who would be his godfather, and Robert for the man who had been Minnie's husband and Clara's father, whose tools had built the cradle in which James Robert now slept. Wallace held his son for the first time that April morning and looked down at him with an expression of total absorption. And Minnie, propped on the pillows in the bed with the afternoon light coming through the curtained window, watched her husband hold their son and felt the full weight of how extraordinarily much had changed in 2 years, and could not contain what she felt and did not try to. He looked up and saw the tears on her face and was at her side instantly, hand on her forehead, concern in his eyes. "Are you hurting? Should I get the doctor back?" "I am not hurting," she said. "I am happy. There is a difference and you should learn to tell it." He looked at her for a moment, and then he sat on the edge of the bed beside her with the baby in the crook of his arm and took her hand with his free one. "I am learning," he said. "You are getting better at it," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair and sat there holding both of them, and outside, Clara could be heard informing the cat Beatrice that her brother had arrived and was, in her assessment, satisfactory. The years that settled in after that were full years. the kind full of the particular riches that ordinary life on a working ranch can produce when the people living it are genuinely in partnership and genuinely in love. Wallace expanded the cattle operation in 1877, buying an additional pasture to the north from an elderly neighbor who was moving to live with his daughter in San Antonio. And Minnie took on the accounts for the ranch with a methodical thoroughness that revealed the schoolteacher's daughter she was. And under her management, the books balanced in a way they had not always managed to do under Wallace's less systematic approach. Clara grew up smart and serious and funny and completely herself, and by the time she was 8 she could ride better than most adults in Heller's Crossing, and had appointed herself the primary manager of the chicken yard, with a seriousness of purpose that the chickens seemed to find persuasive. She also discovered she had her father Robert's gift for working with her hands, and Wallace, recognizing it, began teaching her to use the tools in the barn in the careful, methodical way Robert would have taught her if he had lived to see her old enough. Minnie watched this one afternoon from the barn doorway, her daughter bent over a workbench with a hand plane, Wallace standing beside her with his arms crossed talking her through the motion, and she felt such a complex layering of love and loss and gratitude that she simply stood in the doorway and breathed it for a long moment before going back to the house. She told Wallace about it that night in the dark and warmth of their room, and he was quiet for a moment after she finished, and then he said, "He would have been glad she has the gift. He would have liked you," Minnie said. "The two of you would have been friends, I think." "I think so too," Wallace said, and meant it. He had the capacity to hold the people Minnie had loved before him with respect and without jealousy, which was not a universal quality, and which she valued more than she could easily say. In the spring of 1878, Minnie found she was expecting again. She was 32 and Wallace was 38, and they had James Robert, who was 2 years old and getting into everything, and the news was received with the same thorough joy as the first time. This baby was a girl, born in November of 1878, and they named her Elena after Minnie's mother, and she came into the world with a full set of opinions about it from the first moment, which was going to make her either a trial or a delight, or, as it turned out, largely both. Jim Hart was by now such a fixture at the Walker table that Clara had adopted him as a sort of honorary uncle, and he had recently, and finally, at the age of 44, found himself a wife, a capable and funny woman named Dora who had come west from Georgia and taken one look at the Texas hill country and decided it suited her, and the four of them, Wallace and Minnie and Jim and Dora, made up a friendship that was one of the best things about living in that part of Texas in those years. The tools hung in the barn on a dedicated rack that Wallace had built for them in the first winter, when he had decided they deserved better than a crate. They were used regularly, carefully, the way good tools are meant to be used, and every ranch project that involved them was a thread connecting back to the beginning of things. Minnie noticed, one spring afternoon, that Wallace had been working on something in the barn that he had not told her about. She had seen the shavings on the barn floor and the smell of fresh-cut cedar, and when she finally asked him about it, he showed her a small wooden box, beautifully made, with hand-cut dovetail joints and a fitted lid and a simple carved pattern on the top. "What is it for?" she asked. "It is for the tools," he said. "A proper box. The crate was never good enough." She looked at the box for a long time. It was beautiful. It was exactly right. She looked up at him, and he was watching her with the warm, direct gaze that still hit her the same way it had the first time she had fully understood what it meant, back in the kitchen at Christmas 2 years earlier. "You used Robert's tools to make a box for Robert's tools," she said. "It seemed appropriate," he said. She kissed him in the middle of the barn on a Tuesday afternoon, with the smell of cedar shavings around them and the horses watching with the mild, incurious gaze of horses. And she held his face in her hands and thought about the morning she had walked up this road with her heart in her stomach and a wooden crate balanced against her hip, and no idea what was on the other side of the next hour. She had come to trade a box of tools for a winter's shelter, and she had been given something so much larger than that, so much more than that, that the original transaction felt like a foundation stone buried deep in the ground of everything that had been built on top of it. A home, a husband, a full life. James Robert, who was 2 years old and had recently mastered the art of getting into the barn on his own, appeared in the doorway at this point and said, "Papa, horse," with urgent clarity, pointing at the corral, because the gate had come unlatched and two of the horses were nosing at it. Wallace sighed and kissed Minnie's forehead and went to deal with the horses, and she stood in the barn with the smell of cedar and hay and the new wooden box sitting on the workbench. And she laughed quietly to herself with the particular happiness of a person who is entirely at home in their life. The summer of 1879 was a long, hot one, with the creek running low by August and the grass browning early in the south pasture, and it required extra work to keep the cattle fed and watered. And Wallace and Minnie worked through it with the steady teamwork that 5 years of building a life together had made into second nature. Jim Hart's ranch was adjacent now, thanks to the 1877 land purchase, and the two families helped each other through the worst of the dry months, sharing water rights on the creek section that ran between their properties and coordinating the cattle movements so neither herd overtaxed any section of the available grass. Dora Hart had a baby that summer too, a boy she named William, and the two households were as intertwined as families who are not related by blood but have chosen each other completely, which is its own kind of family and perhaps a better kind in some respects. Clara turned 9 in the autumn of 1879 and had become, by general acknowledgement of everyone in Heller's Crossing, a formidable small person. She had Robert's hands and Wallace's steadiness and Minnie's sharp tongue, and entirely her own particular personality, and the combination was impressive. She had also, in the way of children of that era and region, started learning to read seriously and with appetite, working her way through Wallace's library with a focus and determination that he encouraged absolutely. Because a man who kept a library in the hill country of Texas in 1874 was a man who believed in the value of reading and was glad to share that belief. On a Sunday morning in October of 1879, the whole family was in the kitchen, the autumn light coming clean and gold through the windows, and James Robert was on the floor with a set of wooden animals that Wallace had carved for him over the summer, and Alina was in the high chair banging a spoon against the tray with the methodical satisfaction of a person conducting an important experiment, and Clara was at the table reading, and Minnie was making breakfast. And Wallace was sitting at the table with his coffee and the newspaper that had come in from San Antonio 3 days late, as the San Antonio paper always did, and he looked up from the paper and looked around the kitchen at all of it. At all of them, and something in his expression made Minnie notice. "What?" she said. He shook his head slowly, not dismissively but with the motion of a man who is unable to adequately convey what he is thinking. "Nothing," he said. "Just all of this." She understood. She put down the spoon she had been using and went to him and put her hand on his shoulder, and he covered it with his, and they stayed like that for a moment, anchored in the ordinary, extraordinary morning. "5 years ago," she said quietly, so only he could hear her over the noise of James Robert and Alina's respective activities. "5 years ago," he agreed. He turned his head and looked up at her. "I almost did not take the trade." She raised her eyebrows. "You never told me that. You walked up with the child on your back and the crate on your hip," he said, "and I thought, this woman came 12 miles in the autumn heat with no horse, and she is still standing up straight, and she is offering a fair trade, and she is not asking for charity. And I thought, if I do not take this trade I am a fool, and whatever comes of it I am not a fool." "What did you think would come of it?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "I did not let myself think that far," he said, "but I hoped." She leaned down and kissed the top of his head. "So did I," she said. I walked 12 miles hoping, though I did not admit it to myself until much later. The hoping was the first thing we shared, he said. She straightened up and went back to the stove, and outside, the October sun was making the live oaks luminous, and the horses were moving in the pasture, and somewhere in the yard Clara had gone out with the cat, who was not actually named Beatrice anymore, but who still answered to it on the occasions it answered to anything at all, and the day was opening up before all of them with the unhurried generosity of a good day in a good life. The tools hung in their cedar box in the barn. The cedar box sat on the shelf Wallace had built for it above the workbench, and it was a beautiful thing in a working barn full of practical things, a beautiful thing made with care and skill from good wood, and it was there every day when Wallace or Clara went to the barn for a project, and it was there on the evenings when Minnie sometimes went and opened it, not because she needed a tool, but because some things are worth returning to, worth feeling in your hands again, worth being reminded of. Not as grief, as gratitude. She had carried those tools 12 miles in the autumn of 1874, her husband 4 months in the ground and her daughter on her back and everything she owned between her arms, and she had offered a fair trade to a quiet man she did not know, and he had taken the trade and given her back a world. He had taken the tools, and he had given her a home. The autumn of 1880 arrived, and Wallace turned 40, and Minnie organized a celebration that surprised him, because he was not a man who announced his birthdays or expected occasions to be made of them. But she had quietly coordinated with Jim and Dora Hart, and a handful of the other neighbors they had come to know well in the years since she had come to the ranch, and there was a supper table that night that held 12 people and more food than could possibly be eaten, and more laughter than the walls of the house had probably ever contained. And Clara had made a cake with the help of Dora Hart that was lopsided and magnificent and tasted better than any cake Minnie had ever eaten in her life. Wallace sat at the head of his table and looked at all of it, and Minnie, watching him from the other end, knew what he was thinking because she could read it in the set of his shoulders and the softened line around his eyes and the particular quality of stillness that was the stillness of contentment, the one she had learned to recognize back in that first winter. He was thinking, "This is mine, all of it, all of them," and she was thinking exactly the same thing about him. After the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the kitchen was cleaned, they sat on the front porch together in the cool October dark, the same porch where he had asked her and she had said yes 5 years before, and the stars over the hill country were brilliant and thick, the way they are when you are far enough from town for the darkness to be real. 40, Minnie said. 40, he confirmed. How does it feel? He thought about it honestly, as he thought about everything. It feels considerably better than 39, he said. That is because 39 was before all of this, she said, gesturing broadly at the night at the ranch, at the invisible interior of the house where their children slept. 34 was worse, he said, that autumn, before you came up the road. Tell me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I had built the ranch, he said slowly. I had done everything I meant to do when I came back from the war, built the thing I said I would build. And it was a good ranch, and I was proud of it, and it was also completely quiet in a way that had started to weigh on me that year more than it had before. I was not unhappy, exactly, but I was not complete. He paused. I had not admitted that to myself when you walked up the road, but I knew it when I saw you standing in the barn doorway. I knew something had changed. You did not show it, Minnie said. No, he agreed. I was not going to show it to a woman I had met approximately 60 seconds earlier and who was trying to conduct a fair business transaction and clearly had enough to manage without a rancher making eyes at her. Minnie laughed. You did not make eyes at me. I did not make eyes at you until approximately January, he said. You looked at me in the barn in November, she said, in front of the mare. That was not just professional interest in the horse's leg. A pause. No, he said. It was not. She leaned against his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, and the stars burned overhead, and somewhere out in the pasture one of the horses moved in the dark and settled again, and the ranch was all around them in the October night, alive and present and solid. "Wallace," she said. "Minnie," he said. "We made a good thing here," she said. "We did," he said. "We made the best thing." He pressed his lips to her temple and kept them there for a long moment. "I want you to know that I am aware every day of how good it is." "I know you are," she said. "That is one of the things I love most about you. You are not the kind of man who forgets to notice." "You taught me some of that," he said. "You already had it," she said. "The tools were on the shelf and the garden was planted and the books were read. You already knew how to notice. You just needed something worth noticing again." He turned to look at her and she looked back at him. And after 40 years and 6 years and all the years of all their lives before they found each other, the look between them was the same look it had always been, the warm, clear, certain look of two people who have come home to each other and know it with their whole selves. The porch held them. The ranch held them. The hill country of Texas held them in its cedar-scented dark. And inside the house the children slept in the rooms Wallace had built and Minnie had made into a home. And in the barn the tools lay in their cedar box. And on the wall of the kitchen, where Minnie had put it the spring after they were married, and where it had hung ever since, was a framed piece of paper on which she had written in her careful schoolteacher's daughter handwriting the 3 words that were the beginning of everything. For winter evenings. Not just a book inscription, a whole life. A whole life contained in 3 words written by a quiet rancher who had hoped, and a widow who had walked 12 miles with everything left to her and offered a fair trade, and between the two of them had built something that neither could have built alone, something that was warm in winter and cool in summer and full of children's voices and good meals and hard work and laughter and the absolute daily certainty of love. Every window had light in it. Every room was occupied. Every board of the floor had been walked on and known by the people who belonged to this place, and the place belonged to them as fully and finally as a place can belong to people, not because of a deed or a title, but because of the years put into it, the care, the choosing of it every day. Minnie Easton had come to trade a box of tools, and Wallace Walker had looked at her standing in his barn doorway and taken the tools and given her, in return, everything he had and everything he was. They sat on the porch until the October cold drove them inside, and then they went in together, checked the children, banked the fires, and came to the warmth of their room. And outside the stars burned on over the hill country, and the horses stood in the dark pasture, and the cedar trees were silver in the moonlight. And it was the end of a good day and the beginning of tomorrow, and tomorrow was going to be another good day, and then the one after that, and all the days that came after that, stretching forward into a future that was not afraid and not uncertain but full and lit and entirely, completely theirs.